Yep, it's November 6th, 2021. It's a chilly Saturday morning, and I think today's the day I make the video that gets my channel banned. We'll see. I don't know what the title of this video is going to be yet, but I do know it will be something not clickbaity necessarily, but something that will draw your attention. Because I'm gonna put something like defending racism or why racism is right, something like that. So yeah, that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about racism. And well, I have said this in previous videos. I consider myself liberal. I believe in liberalism. I tend to think that, I've reached a point in my life where I was an atheist, and then I sort of hit a nihilistic point, and I didn't really believe in anything, and then I figured out that I sort of use liberalism as a place to stand now at this point. I think that it's a really good, it's kind of where I've decided to put my chips down. I know that from a purely scientifically rational perspective, it's not correct, but I sort of believe in it as a kind of an act of faith, you could say. And I have found something. I have found that racism, well, how do I say this? So, I am also a very strong believer in evolutionary biology. I believe the evolutionary story, the general story of the origin of life on Earth and the origin of humans and the origin of all living things, really. If I look around this forest, all the animals and plants and, me, we all come from the same place, and we've all descended from the same line of organisms. And this process that Darwin discovered back in 1858 or whatever it was, the one that he wrote down back then at least, this process has created all of us. And this matters. It matters that the understanding of this matters. So, first of all, I'd like to say, if you don't think that humans are animals, if you don't think we share common ancestry with monkeys or primates, or, if you don't really believe that story, if you have some alternative story for how you got here, how I got here, I would say turn this video off right now, because everything that I'm going to say from now on is going to make no sense, and it will just sound ridiculous. Please turn the video off, please. I'm telling you, do not watch further, because everything I'm about to say is based off of evolutionary biology. So yeah, I have this belief in evolutionary biology just because it's, I studied it in college a little bit. I studied it in high school especially, but it's something that I've been personally interested in and passionate about to some degree. I have thought about it a lot, I think. And like I said, I also put my chips down on liberalism, right? I think liberalism is correct. I think it is how we should design our society around this idea. All of our systems should be based off liberalism, in my opinion. That's just like I said, it's where I put my chips down. But the problem is I see a conflict between evolutionary biology and liberalism. There's a conflict. And that conflict emerges as the conflict emerges in the form, there's a conflict that looks a lot like racism, I think. I don't know if it is racism, so I'm going to try and talk about that. I think something's going on here where the problem is that racism is actually correct from an evolutionary biological standpoint. You can defend certain racist ideas, certain racist concepts, and it is, well, I want to talk about it. I have to, this is how I think about it. I'm going to talk through it. Yeah, I mean, that's just what I have to do. We'll see what happens. I don't know exactly what I'm going to say. And I get the feeling that I'm going to say things that are controversial, I guess. I mean, I have to do this. So here we go. I actually wrote down something for this one. This is right here, the definition of racism according to Wikipedia. So in my previous video, I tried to define racism on my own. I talked about the definition of racism. I talked about systemic racism. You know, I tried to get into some of the deeper, more kind of the institutional, historical understandings of racism, you know, the structural racism. Today, I'm simply going to talk about the sort of the classic definition, which I think is kind of the Wikipedia definition. So, here we go. Wikipedia, word for word. I think, as long as I wrote it down correctly. The belief that groups of humans possess different behavioral traits corresponding to inherited attributes and can be divided based on the superiority of one race over another. So, see, I don't think this is wrong. This belief that I just described is not wrong. And let me explain, because like there's so many different ways to interpret this, right? And I want to go through all the steps, you know, and I know that I've said this before. I'm talking to a YouTube video. I understand that through this medium I can't respond to issues that come up inside the people's brains that I'm talking to. And I know where the issues are. I've had this conversation with human beings face to face plenty of times. And I know the quick counter arguments, and I ask you to trust that I have thought of them, or at least I understand enough of what you're going to think. Like, I'm going to try and get there. Let me just see if I can cover all the bases and talk about all of it. So, first of all, racism is a belief. I think everybody agrees on that. It's a belief. So I'm trying to talk about whether this belief is correct or not. And so the belief, I'm going off the Wikipedia definition here. The belief that groups of humans possess different behavioral traits corresponding to inherited attributes. So this is an interesting one. Inherited, that sort of means genetic, right? I think that inherited can be swapped out with genetic in this one. Inherited, inherent, sort of, like you're born with it. These are traits that you're born with. And then so I think what's interesting in this definition is it specifically says behavioral, because there are clearly traits that we're born with that are not behavioral. And so, you know, if you were to take out the word behavioral, it would actually change quite a bit here, because then I could just say, oh, skin color plays into this, and somebody with darker skin could be superior or inferior to somebody with lighter skin. Or, you know, I've talked about this in other videos, but you can just see, what's interesting about this is, like, I'm going to talk about what happens if you take away the word behavioral from this. So, different races have different average heights. You can just go around the world and measure the average height of men or women, and then just see how the averages change along racial categories. And so it's actually interesting if you're watching a soccer game, for example, between like Denmark and some South American country. You'll notice the commentators might actually talk about how on a corner kick, the Denmarkians, the Northern Europeans, will have an advantage over the South Americans because they'll be slightly taller on average, more able to get a header, you know? This is for soccer, at least. And so, like I said, if you take the word behavioral out of this, now one race is superior to another in terms of height, at least. And so, I think that's why the word behavioral is important here. Because you can take this word superior. It's funny, if you look at the Wikipedia definition, it will have superior as a blue link. You can click on superior or superiority. Because I think, you know, a lot of this really, the definition of superiority, I'll get to that in a second, but if you click on it, it just links you to supremacism, the Wikipedia page on supremacism. and the definition of supremacism includes the word superior. So the way you define superior here really, really matters. And it's like, if we're talking about height, what does superiority mean? Like, is being taller superior to being shorter? Is maybe shorter superior to being taller? I think superiority sort of matters. Your value system comes into play now. Like, what do we value? And if we do value something, if we value certain characteristics, and we can articulate those values, we can define those values, then surely we can graph human beings on those values. Like height. Height's an easy one. You can just graph all the people by height, and you can say, okay, the ones that are further over on this side are superior to the ones that aren't. But anyway, I wanted to let me take a step backwards here. So I shouldn't have jumped ahead to superiority already. I got to talk about corresponding to inherited attributes. So it's another interesting thing here, because corresponding. So it's saying the belief that groups of humans possess different behavioral traits corresponding to inherited attributes. So traits that correspond to inherited attributes. So here is another interesting little fork in the road, because some traits correspond to inherited attributes in the sense that some traits are genetic, right? So truly, like skin color, the trait corresponds to it is an inherited attribute. My skin looks like my parents' skin, right? Because it's genetic. Same as my height, same as all of my physical characteristics. Since I'm an animal that is born and born of two other animals, and we know that you sort of get the combined DNA of your two parents, and so you look like your parents, right? So you have an inherited attributes. That is just true. So this is saying that. So this is talking about traits that correspond to inherited attributes. So I want to talk about what that means. What does correspond mean? Does it mean traits that directly come from inherited attributes? Or does it mean traits that are... What does correspond mean? What does correspond mean? Because you can interpret this a couple different ways. You could say, okay, what this means is traits that are genetic, right? It means specifically traits that are passed from parent to child, genetically. I think the issue is this: there are traits that correspond to inherited attributes in the sense that there are traits that you get from your parents that are not genetic, like their beliefs, their traditions. A lot of what we do as animals, behaviorally. The thing is, like, our traditions, our culture, if we're talking about the nature versus nurture argument, our nurture, the things that we're not born with but we're raised to believe and raised to do, still corresponds to inherited traits. Because, everybody in India, how do I say this? I don't want to say this. If you have a racially homogenous population, or like mostly racially homogenous, first of all of the parents in that group are going to have kids that are of the same race, right? Because it's homogenous. Every time an Indian person marries another Indian person and has a child, they produce an Indian person. Physically, they have to. There's no other way to do this. But the thing is that they also pass down traditions and they pass down behaviors that do correspond to inherited traits. If I meet an Indian person, I'm talking like, I know that I'm using an example that is like, I ask that you just take my argument in good faith. I'm saying that if you meet somebody and they look a certain way, you can bet, right? You could put money down that they will behave a certain way. If an Indian person's born in the United States, if they're born outside of like a I shouldn't have used Indian as an example. I mean, I'm just trying to say that you can, I'm not saying that you, how do I say this? What I'm trying to say is that there are certain traits that correspond to inherited attributes that are not genetic. They correspond, right? I'm not saying all people that look Indian behave a certain way. That's not what I'm trying to say here. What I'm saying is that there are traits that correspond to inherited attributes that are not genetic. That's what I'm trying to say. And I mean, this is something that we all agree on. This is something obvious if you think about it. We have behaviors and traditions and cultures that fall along racial lines. You know, this is not a surprise to anybody. You know, like we make jokes about it sometimes. They can be inappropriate jokes. We can be like, all people of this race do that, you know? I think where you get in trouble is when you say all, when you make an unreasonable judgment, when you start to say, like if I was to meet somebody in the United States who was Indian and I was to like immediately assume that they're definitely going to get an arranged marriage or something, right? If I were like, that might be something that would be unreasonable for me to assume. So that's, I know that there's like, I'm walking an interesting line here. I'm trying to walk this line. I'm just saying that if you were to interpret this definition simply as genetic, it means something different than if you were to interpret it as, like, it just, the word corresponding, it just depends on what you mean by corresponding. And so, for the sake of this video, going forward, I'm going to say corresponding to inherited attributes specifically means genetic. It means genetic attributes. So, yeah, I hope I didn't hang too long on that. I didn't spend too much time on that. Okay, so the belief that groups of humans possess different behavioral traits corresponding to inherited attributes. So, if you were to just take only that, the thing is that's true. We do. Let me take that back. Wow, I shouldn't have said that. Is that true? That's what I'm asking. Is it true that there are behavioral traits that correspond to inherited attributes? Do we have... Wow, I shouldn't have... So if you're saying that correspond is just genetic, right? Because obviously if correspond means something more than genetic, then we do know that there are behavioral traits that correspond to inherited attributes. We know that because of tradition, because of culture. But I'm talking about genetics specifically. Do our genes affect our behavior? And are our genetics different enough amongst races that there will be different behavioral traits between us, right? Like, so this is an interesting question. Probably a very spicy question if you get into, if you ask the right questions here. So, are there behavioral differences between race? Are there behavioral differences between races? If you believe the answer to that is yes, you are racist. That is a racist belief. If you believe the answer is no, you would be not racist, right? So what is the answer to that? What is the answer? Are there behavioral differences between us? How would you know the answer to that? How would you study that? If I wanted to ask that question scientifically, if I wanted to answer that question scientifically, what would I do? So you might think you could take a group of people and then divide them based on race. You can have a control group where they're not divided based on race, and you could give them some kind of test that tests their behavior, something like that. You could study them, do an observational study where you just go, okay, we're going to study these different groups. But, obviously, our behaviors are more affected by our nurture than by our nature, right? So when you're trying to study the difference between races, what would you end up studying? You would likely end up studying sociological differences. You would likely end up studying traits that correspond to inherited attributes, but not correspond genetically. Traits that correspond simply through the pass down of like the software layer, right? Like the you can almost imagine this nature versus nurture, hardware versus software. I'm kind of drawing a dichotomy here. We inherit hardware and software from our parents. And if you were to attempt to study behavioral traits, you would likely end up studying the software that gets passed down, which is just tradition and culture and things like that. So, again, I'm asking this question. Do different groups possess different behavioral traits on a hardware level? Are there genetic behaviors that are different between races? Again, how do you answer this question? How do you answer this question? Somebody who's naive, I think, somebody who is liberal and wants to just jump to the easy answer, to the politically correct answer, will say, of course there are no behavioral differences. Of course not. But how do they know? How do you know that? I don't think you can know that. Because imagine trying to set up a study. How would you study this? How would you answer this question one way or the other? I can't really think of a study off the top of my head, at least like right now. I mean, if we were to, how would you carefully dissect? How would you carefully study the hardware without software interfering? And so I tend to think about things like this is just something that I think about. So imagine if you believe the out of Africa theory, right? The idea that humans emerged from Africa somewhere between 50, 100,000 years ago. I mean, the story's complicated, right? There were other species of humans. There were other organisms that fell into the family Homo that migrated out of Africa before us, and they spread around the planet. And then when Homo sapiens migrated out, they did breed with various other human species. And this has been happening for tens of thousands of years, and I'm going to throw out some numbers, right? And if the numbers are wrong that I'm throwing out, it doesn't make my idea wrong, because as long as I'm within orders of magnitude, right? So I believe the current consensus scientifically is that humans diverged from chimpanzees 6 million years ago. But if it turns out it's like 7 or 9 or 5, it doesn't make what I'm saying wrong, right? I'm going with rough estimates just because it's what's available to me. And I generally believe these to be true. If it turns out that we diverged from chimpanzees 600 million years ago, that would be a significant wrench, But as long as I'm within orders of magnitude. So what I'm trying to say is that the consensus for when humans all diverged from each other, Homo sapiens, is, it can go back as far as 100,000 years, but I think that's probably the upper limit. It depends on which group you're looking at. Like Aboriginal Australians seem to have diverged longer ago than other groups would have diverged. But the point is that we have had humans spreading around the planet for tens of thousands of years. It's at least tens of thousands, possibly up to 100,000, somewhere between 10,000 and 100,000. And so when you take a population of animals and you just have them move somewhere else, they end up becoming physically isolated, right? Like there wasn't a lot of genetic transfer back and forth because they didn't have planes. They weren't. If you're born in South America in the year 20,000 BC, you're not going to see somebody from Africa. You're not going to see somebody from Asia, So all of your mating is going to happen within your physical environment. And all those people are going to end up looking different because what happens with human populations, with any animal population, what happens with any population of organisms that becomes physically isolated from another population of organisms, especially when they're living in different environments, right? Like the environment I'm in right now looks different than other environments in the world. So if you have animals living in different environments long enough, they end up diverging evolutionarily. So evolution has been continuing to happen for the tens of thousands of years that human beings have been separated from each other, right? That's, again, why my face looks like this. This is why my hair looks like this, right? My face, my hair, my body looks different from the humans that have been physically isolated from me genetically for a very long time. So when people say race doesn't exist, they're just like, they're lying. Unless, I mean, it depends on what you mean by race, but populations of humans exist, right? And these populations are genetically divergent, and you can test this. I could take a genetic sample and hand it to a bioinformatician and they could tell me what race that DNA is. Like, you could take a whole bunch of vials of blood samples from various races, and scientists could tell you which race each of those blood vials is without ever seeing the person, because we have enough genomes mapped, I assume at this point, to be able to distinguish racially based off of a genome. And the same thing goes for skeletons. I could hand a forensic scientist, I could hand somebody a bone scientist, I could give them a skeleton of a person, and they could tell me with a degree of accuracy what race that person was, right? And so what I'm trying to say is that the differences between races, between these populations of humans, is not simply skin deep. The differences are our entire bodies, right? Our entire genomes, really, have been diverging from each other. And it's not like it's been, it's interesting. If you look at the difference between us and chimpanzees, like I said, 6 million years have gone by, according to current understandings. According to what I understand, 6 million years have gone by between me and a chimpanzee, something like that. And so that's, I don't know how many generations, but it's enough generations that I look like this and a chimpanzee looks like that. And that's, I can't mate with a chimpanzee, so we're different species. So for humans, like I said, the upper limit seems to be about 100,000 years. It might be more than that, it might be less. That is a fraction, a very small fraction of the difference between me and chimpanzees, obviously. And it's not enough time for us to become different species, because we can still mate, but it is enough time for significant genetic differences to occur. And we can see the differences immediately, like I keep saying. The differences are visible to a child, to a 2-year-old, can tell the difference. So, back to this definition. We can see that there's physical differences between the humans, and it goes into our skin. Our skin is different, our bone structure is different, our entire genome, not our entire genome, but there are genetic differences across the whole genome, which means that there are differences across our entire bodies, right? Everything between your skin and your bones can also be different. And so, here's the thing, is that our brains, our neurological systems, our endocrinological fuck, I can't pronounce that word. Our endocrine systems are different. our metabolic processes might be slightly different. And not wildly different, but different enough, like there's been at least 1,000, maybe 5,000 generations between us. And if we just live in different environments long enough, we start to adapt to those environments. We can't, it's just part of evolution. And so what I'm trying to get at here is, like, since my ancestors have lived in a different environment than your ancestors, for example, whoever's watching this, it's possible that they had access to different kinds of food over time, right? And as organisms, we need to consume certain nutrients to stay alive. So, if you think about it, like, why does a strawberry taste good? Why does a piece of fruit taste good? Why does a juicy piece of meat taste good? Why does something salty taste good? Salty, sweet. Like, we have a variety of things that we all kind of agree sort of taste good, right? That we all enjoy. It's because, these things taste good because evolution has designed us to enjoy foods that are providing us with nutrients that we need, right? And so, the foods that you enjoy are, think about how this affects your behavior, right? Like, if I were to show you a pine cone or show you a bag of chips, which one are you going to eat? I think most of us would eat the bag of chips before we'd eat the pine cone, if we were hungry, So that's a behavior, isn't it? Isn't our choosing to eat a certain thing a behavior? And is that not genetically design. That's part of nature. That's not part of nurture. There's no culture that could have been put on you. I mean, bag of chips might be a bad example, but no matter what culture or what upbringing you have, if I were to put you in a room with a variety of kinds of foods to eat, there are certain foods you would eat and certain foods you wouldn't eat, and certain things you wouldn't even consider food, right? And we could run this experiment with a thousand different ways. But the point is all humans across the planet will agree on which things to eat and which things not to eat, generally, right? There'll be certain behavioral differences, but those will correspond to inherited attributes because of tradition, because of the software layer, right? So, what I'm trying to say here is, it is actually possible, if you think about it, that human beings have lived in environments different from each other long enough that our hardware might have changed in the sense that it might make us enjoy different foods differently. So when I bite into a strawberry, the experience that I get, like the actual experience of that moment, might be slightly different than the experience of somebody who comes from an environment radically different from mine, right? And, strawberry might be a bad example. Maybe strawberries taste exactly the same to everybody. I'm just saying that there is reason to believe that there are certain experiences we have, like animalistic experiences, that it's possible that there's differences in our experiences. Simply from evolving separately from each other for long enough. I mean, this is kind of it's a guess, it's a hypothesis. And the way that I would test this is I would put people into a room, like I said. I would have different foods available. The problem with foods is that it's very much based on your acquired taste over time. Like, you can see why this is so difficult to tease out from the software. It's so difficult to tease out from how we were raised. Like, how would you study a behavioral difference between two groups of people? And how would you say for sure that it's genetic? I don't know. I don't know how to study that. And the thing is I don't think you... Let me think about this for 1 second. Like, here's another way of thinking about it. What if there's some sort of poisonous animal that only exists in South America, right? And it's colored some color, right? You would think that the animals that live in that area of South America, like if there was some, this is kind of like a thought experiment, kind of a silly example, but like if there was some poisonous animal that killed you very quickly if you touched it, and it only lived in a certain environment, you would think that the other animals that lived in that environment would evolve and adapt to the presence of this animal, right? And it would mean that those other animals would eventually have an inherent attribute, right? A genetic attribute that would alter their behavior to avoid this certain animal, right? And so how can we sit here and say that human beings that grew up in North Africa versus, Eastern Asia versus South America versus, North America, like, humans have clearly existed in radically different environments for tens of thousands of years. And, one of the cool things about humans is that we're smart enough to overcome challenges in all these areas. We're able to adapt, like with our brains. Our software is very adaptable, so we don't need hardware changes, usually. But the hardware is still going to change over time. Clearly, because our faces look different. Our hardware has been changing. And to sit here and say that it has not been affecting our behavior, I think is wrong. I don't think you can say for sure that our behavior has not been affected by our environments over time. I don't think you can say for sure that there are no behavioral differences between races. Can I sit here and tell you what the differences are? No. Can I sit here and say that they for sure do exist? No. I can't. I can't tell you that I think they exist for sure, but I can tell you that you can't be confident that they don't exist. That's what I'm trying to say. And so, onward. This last part of this definition. So, the first part is the belief that groups of humans possess different behavioral traits corresponding to inherited attributes. So like I said, The belief. You can't be sure that this belief is right or wrong, is what I'm saying. You can't be sure. Scientifically speaking, you cannot be sure. You can choose to believe that there are no behavioral differences, but that is an act of faith. You're not doing that scientifically. And then so, there's a second part to this definition. It just says and. So corresponding to inherited attributes and can be divided based on the superiority of one race over another. Okay. And that's where we get back to this concept of superiority. So, like I said, if you click on the link, if you click on superiority on that page on Wikipedia, it brings you to another page called supremacism. And then supremacism just uses the word superiority again. So they never define the word superiority. It's a simply undefined word. I mean, it's up to your interpretation, really. So I'm already 35 minutes into this video. I don't know if I want to get into this idea of superiority right now. Maybe I do. Maybe I do. So, like I said, my chips are down on liberalism. They are. I can't tell you scientifically that liberalism is correct, but I can say that I have faith in liberalism. It is where I've decided to base all my beliefs off of. Consciously. I've consciously chosen this. I think. Maybe it's just a rationalization of my own. That's another video. But there's this issue here, is that since I don't know that there are no behavioral differences, I can't know that scientifically, which means they might exist. How am I to? How do I interpret superiority? How do I interpret that? What does superiority mean? Can a person be superior to another person? Under the definition of liberalism, I would say that the law, that the systems we set up should treat everybody as if they're equal, right? So you would not treat anybody as if they're superior. But we're talking about this belief, this racism. It's the belief that there are behavioral differences between races corresponding to genetic differences, right? It's the belief that there's behavior that corresponds to genetics, and the belief that this makes one human superior to another. So, wow, here's where I get myself into big trouble. Big trouble. What if, I'm just asking a question right now. This is me I'm simply asking a question. It's an offensive question. What if there are genetic behavioral differences between humans that make one group of humans superior to another? What if? And so, this depends on what you mean by superiority. So like most people are going to say, because I talked about height in the beginning, I could talk about skin, for example. Like, black people are superior at not getting sunburned, right? And I would say that my skin is superior at producing vitamin D with less sunlight. So that's the correct use of the word superior, right? Have I not correctly used that word? So superior kind of implies that there is a value system where you value one thing above another. So if I say what I value is the ability to not get sunburned, right? Now, since I have a value, I can measure people, and then I can graph them based off that value. And if the value is resistance to sunburn, I'm going to put myself at the lower end. I would say I'm going to be inferior at that one, and I would put black people at the higher end. I'd say they're superior at that one. So it's like, superiority is, there is a real, where do I go from here? How do I say this? So let me talk about how this would affect race and racism, right? You're going to have people, if you would have, so what would a white supremacist say? Somebody who thinks that white people are superior, and they would use let's just take somebody who's racist. They're going to say, okay, Look at the current state of the world. Look at how white people have money right now. And they would say that this is for a reason. They would say that this is because white people are superior. That's what they would say. So what exactly are they talking about when they say superior? Like, what? Do white people have superior handling of money? Do white people have superior ability to colonize other countries? Like, if you look at the real reasons why our society is currently set up the way it is, you can come up with historical reasons that make sense. That probably don't have anything to do with inherited attributes, like genetic attributes, right? You could come up with. See, I think the problem is a lot of white supremacists don't believe humans are animals. They have an alternative definition for humans, or an alternative understanding of where human beings came from. I said this in a different video. I talked to a guy who said that if you look at the Cain and Abel story, no, not the Cain. If you look at the Noah story in the Bible, Noah had like 3 descendants, and one group of those descendants became the slaves of the other 2 groups because he was cursed because he disrespected Noah. And this person told me that this is where black people come from, right? So it's like, that's not, I can't do anything with that. You know what I mean? Like, I can't have a conversation with that, because that's to talk about that, you'd have to talk about the Bible, you have to talk about the existence of God, you'd have to, that goes down an entirely different pathway of thoughts that I'm not trying to go down at all right now. So those kinds of white supremacists, the ones who don't base it off of an evolutionary explanation, I'm not talking to them or about them. There's nothing I can do with them, right? But there are. So this comes to this. To me, this is kind of like inseparable from analyzing current society, right? Why is our current society set up the way that it is? And is there... I think that the real question is the current setup a result of behavioral genetic differences? That's the interesting question here. That's what a white supremacist with an evolutionary background would say. That, like, I'm just trying to explain what the stances are on both sides, and then I'm going to talk about where I fall. So, a racial supremacist, even if it's not a white supremacist, any supremacist of any race who thinks their race is the best one, is going to say that yes, the current setup of society is like this because there are behavioral genetic differences that have resulted in this setup, right? The reason that all the white people have all the money is because white people are superior for some reason. So, and they're basing it, like I said, genetically. This is not like a biblical explanation. So that's the argument on one side. And then the counter argument to that would be, the counter argument is that genetic behavioral differences have had no effect. And the current situation that we're in, if you look around at society right now, it is simply a result of it's the software layer. It's the cultures, the traditions, the belief sets, a variety. Every group, every population was sort of dealt a hand of cards of just their environment, right? You kind of get the Jared Diamond, Guns, Germs, and Steel explanation that it's like, it's just a result of where all the groups were. Like, the reason that the England Empire was able to colonize has more to do with their physical setup, like where they were on the globe, and it's more of where the humans were, not who the humans were. So the thing is, like I said earlier, we don't know if there are genetic behavioral differences. Nobody can tell you for sure yes or no to that question. I don't think anybody can. I mean, we can... Okay, so I'm very far into this video. I don't want to keep talking, and then I need to make more videos about this. I need to make a video about IQ. See, this is what you basically get to, this point where it's like, okay, I've established... I don't know where I want to go from here. I don't know if I want to cut off now and make more videos about this, or if I want to keep going and get myself deeper into this, because when you start to bring IQ into the conversation, because basically the next question you have to ask is, okay, if there are behavioral genetic differences between populations of humans, if there are those things, right? And like I said, nobody can say that there aren't for sure. If there are those things, have they affected our current situation that we're in right now? And since our society is so complicated today, you can ask the question, okay, what makes a person successful in a society like this, right? And truly, one of the greatest predictors of success is IQ. It's how intelligent a person is. And so this gets into a like, obviously, I know this is like the biggest can of worms you can possibly open. Like, this is that point. This is the monster at the end of the book, you know? Like, this is the thing that I think that a lot of people on all parts of the spectrum have sort of thought about this. And it comes down to this thing, like, are there IQ differences between races? And, you know, this instantly means you have to ask a couple questions. What is IQ? Does IQ exist? What is intelligence? How do you measure intelligence? And to what degree is intelligence a software thing? Like, are you born with higher IQ? Do you have to get put into a certain position where you get a higher IQ? You know, to what degree is IQ nature and to what degree is IQ nurture? I think, I think you'd have a hard time arguing that it's not a combination of both those things. IQ has got to be a combination of nature and nurture. There's got to be, you're born with a body, and then that body goes through certain experiences, and then you hit a certain level of IQ, of intelligence. And we can sit here and try and measure it, but like I said earlier, how do you separate that out from characteristics that, like, it depends on what you mean by correspond. It comes back to this question again. If we're talking about characteristics that correspond to inherited traits in the sociological sense, in the cultural sense, you know, I don't know if people are going to skip around in these videos. I don't know where I'll be taken out of context. Like, if you've gotten this far in this video, you know what I'm talking about right now. You know that I'm saying that it's impossible to measure, it's impossible to measure genetic IQ in the sense that, like, you couldn't separate IQ as a result of genetics versus like upbringing, right? You can't separate the nurture and the nature of IQ. When you're measuring IQ, there's no way to know how much is on one versus the other, because we can't set up a study that studies that. It's just impossible to study. It's impossible to determine the natural, like, how much is natural born and how much is nurture born, I guess you could say. And so part of the problem is that these questions are kind of unanswerable, at least scientifically. Like, you can't even imagine a study that scientifically answers these. At least I can't imagine it. Maybe somebody else has. Maybe these studies have been done. But I can't, like, it's the problem is I can't even imagine the studies being done. I can't imagine a situation where you could truly control all of the variables correctly to actually do proper science. Studying humans is just too difficult. And, you know, IQ does measure something real. Like, people will say, oh, IQ doesn't mean anything. That's not true. There is something there. There really is. Because if you were to take an IQ test, if you and a buddy took an IQ test, and one of you scored higher and one of you scored lower, you could sit there and be like, okay, what does that mean? What exactly am I talking about? What does this mean? Is one of us smarter than the other? What does it mean to say smarter? What are we talking about when we say intelligence? What's important to me is the fact that if you both took an IQ test again, you would probably score the same ranking. The smarter one would score higher than the not as smart one. Again, right? So whatever it's measuring is there, and it is consistent, and it measures the same thing across time. So And it's hard for me to say that, I mean, isn't it clear to everybody that somebody who's very smart has a higher chance of succeeding today, right? Versus somebody who's not very smart? And what do you mean by success? What do you mean by intelligence? See, this is the problem with these questions, is that you get into these almost like philosophical debates over like, what does it mean to succeed? Like, if you have a society where a certain characteristic is rewarded, right? Like you could sit here and say, okay, people who are industrious, who work 80 hours a week, who are very intelligent, who have like some sort of drive, are going to succeed, right? And so like, what if these characteristics are genetic? What if these behaviors are influenced by racial categories, you know? And I don't know if anybody can say that they're not. I mean, I can understand why you would say that they're not. Like, I get it, and I know that there isn't evidence for it. Like, what I'm saying is that these questions can be asked, but they can't be answered by anything other than faith, you know? Like, if you're a liberal and you're trying to say, no, everybody's equal, that's an act of faith. Like, you can't say everybody's equal, and scientifically, you can't. I mean, it just... You can't prove it. You just can't prove it. That's what I'm trying to say. Is that it hasn't been proven scientifically that all people are equal. And it's weird because it all depends on what you mean by equal. It means what you mean by superior. Like, superior and equal. Like, what do those things even mean? What does intelligence mean? What does success mean? How do we measure these things? I just, it's not as simple as saying racism is wrong, right? You can't... We're in this position now where we say, okay, racism is wrong and racism is evil. And so what you're saying now is that we have this question. The way that I see this is, the way that I interpret this is, we have a question, and you can ask the question, and I think rationally and scientifically, there really is no simple answer to the question. And the problem is that we are calling, so we're standing here at the crossroads of this question, and we're looking down these two pathways, and we're saying that pathway is evil. That pathway is actually wrong and evil. It's like we're equating it to almost like, in the same way that a religion will equate a certain set of behaviors and ideas with Satan, we seem to be, as a society, equating this behavior, not this behavior, we seem to be equating one hallway with badness and one hallway with goodness, Like, we want what our liberal brains want the answer to be, is that of course there are no behavioral differences that correspond to our genetics, right? Of course we're all the same. Of course we're all equal. We all have the same potential and the same IQ and the same everything, and our... that's what we want the answer to be. We see that as the good answer. But it's not scientific. Science doesn't care what we want. It doesn't care what we think is good and bad. And so, this is very confusing to a liberal brain. If we want to treat everybody equally, if we want everybody to be equal, how do we study this question, right? What we need to do is study the question without having... There should be no good or bad, right? There is no good idea or bad idea here. There's just things that are and things that are not, And that's what science is good at. It tells us what is and what is not. It doesn't... what we want doesn't matter. And so... Yeah, that's kind of what I've been trying to get at. I think I did okay with this video. 54 minutes, wow. I've noticed that I have like a very, very, very tiny viewership. Some people do at least play the video to the end. I don't know if they listen to the whole thing. I get the feeling that a lot of these videos are just kind of the thing where somebody will put it on in the background and sort of like half listen. Let me try and... I want to see if I can wrap up this whole thing in a sentence or two. So, what I'm saying is that we don't know whether there are behavioral differences that correspond to genetic traits. We can't say yes or no to that, but we want to say no because of liberalism. And what I'm saying is that, well, I'm saying the question is there. That's all I'm saying. I don't have an answer for it. Liberals think they have the answer. They'll say, of course everybody's equal. And then white supremacists or any racial supremacist will say, of course the races are different. So I think both of these groups are wrong, basically. Or I think I'm not saying they're both wrong. I'm saying they've both overstepped science. They've both gone too far. Neither of them know. Neither of them can know. And that's my stance. So, yeah. Bye.